Do you think this is a true endorsement, and will it help T.O.?
No, because he didn't say he would put him in the Hall of Fame. He said, I think I would.
That's a difference.
That's totally different than I would put him in the Hall of Fame. But he also went to specific examples. And the Hall made a profound statement on Saturday in their meeting when they decided that T.O., that he didn't even have enough votes to move from the finalist list over to that final list that they make where it's either in or out.
He didn't make the final cut.
He didn't make the final cut. Last year, he made the final cut in his first year. And I understand because in my first year of eligibility, I made the finals. I was in the room next to where the press conference was. But I ended up having to go out the back door. The next year, I got less votes. My third year, which he's going to face the same thing, Randy Moss is going to be on the list. Jerry Rice was on the list for me. Andre Reed was already on the list. So this is not a ringing endorsement. The people in the Hall of Fame, not only Dave Baker in the Hall of Fame, but the voters have decided that character and the locker room is an extension of the football field. Bill Parcell is one of the many people that these voters talk to. Bill Parcell gave you the cleaned up version, all right? Because the voters obviously heard some things from Bill Parcell, from former players, and other prominent NFL coaches.
Guys that had coached T.O.
Yeah, guys who coach T.O. and guys that are still coaching in the National Football League. Guys that are highly respected. They had a strong dislike for T.O., his personality, and his lack of being a good teammate. And that affected the vote on Super Bowl Saturday.
But it's not the Hall of Good Teammates. Isn't that the argument?
Here's the argument. There is no argument. The argument is these are people being petty because they all know T.O.'s getting in. There's not a person in that room that believes T.O.'s not getting in, and there's not more than one or two people in that room that believe T.O. shouldn't get in. They just want to make him wait. They didn't like the way he treated Jeff Garcia and Donovan McNabb, and they didn't like the sit-ups in the driveway, and they didn't like his manager saying Terrell's got 25 million reasons to live. They didn't like any of that, so they're slapping him on the wrist. And it's petty,
so
and it's embarrassing.
So you're saying they just made up the part as far as the locker room?
I'm saying they were going to find a reason to make him wait. They found a reason.
And that's because it's him, or it's because it's wide receivers?
It seems to happen disproportionately to wide receivers. I think we could do an interesting sociological examination about the makeup of wide receivers, about the personalities of wide receivers, and the makeup of those folks in that room, and maybe they ain't going to the same cookouts. I do think that exists,
yes.
But...
Only five receivers have been voted in the Hall
first ballot. In the modern era, and I'll just flat out say, people get mad, I don't care, the only black wide receiver to be voted in first ballot is Jerry Rice.
Besides Jerry Rice, Paul Warfield. Paul Warfield.
But he was pre-modern era, right? He was so two in the last. I appreciate the correction.
Yes.
2 in the last 35 years. No, I'm not saying they're racist. What I'm saying is there is a wide receiver. There's a wide receiver personality. Listen, I'll break the whole thing down. Wide receiver is the one position in sports where your success, no matter how great you are, is totally reliant on another individual being at least competent.
Yes.
That then breeds a certain type of attitude and mentality. Selfishness.
You have to be.
You have to be, which is why you have more diva wide receivers than diva nose tackles. And because of that, and because of who gets to decide who's in the Hall, some things bother people that wouldn't bother others. So they're making T.O. wait. They made you wait. They're probably going to make Randy Moss wait. And the whole thing is an embarrassment because they all know you can't write the history of the game without Cris Carter, but you waited 5 years. You can't write the history of the game without Terrell Owens, but he going to wait 3 or 4. You can't write the history of the game without Randy Moss, but he might wait 1 or 2 because they didn't like how they conducted themselves. It ain't a Mr. Congeniality contest. It's a Pro Football Hall of Fame, and it's a travesty. Listen, I don't know T.O. I happen to think I probably wouldn't even like hanging out with him, but I know what he did on the football field. And I know that all the off-the-field stuff, it was Bill Parcells. I'm sorry, but Bill Parcells, he ran 9 instead of 12. Okay, despite all those routes he cut off short, top 3 touchdowns, top 3 yards. Miss me with this Tuesday morning quarterbacking nonsense to make up for the fact that y'all are trying to punish a guy you didn't like.
Well, that's part of the argument, but what you should be arguing is, did they change the finish line? Did they move the target? So now all of a sudden we're shooting at ducks over here. Now all of a sudden we're shooting at cans over here. You know, now he's supposed to run 100 yards. Now they moved it to maybe need to run 110 meters because they moved the finish line for wide receivers. Because the number used to be 1,000 catches and 100 touchdowns. You were in the Hall of Fame.
Like 3,000 hits in baseball.
Yeah, and then a few guys went over that, smashed it. By the way, guy had 1,100 catches, 130 touchdowns. Now, Steve Largent, his catches, his 100 touchdowns, that was fine for him to get in. But since then, they've moved the measurement as far as catches. They've moved the measurement as far as stats. And now they've moved it as far as the effect on the team. The locker room, and that sanctity of the locker room is an extension of the field. They have changed the rules.
That didn't exist before.
It didn't. That came in the last 2 years. And the reason why is because they got so much feedback from former players and former coaches saying it's important what type of teammate you are, because it can be disruptive to the continuity and how football is conducted. Not any other sport, but how football is conducted.
And it's a misnomer that all these teams got rid of him. This idea that all these teams didn't want him. His contract's up in San Francisco. He signs a free agent contract with Philly. He then plays in a Super Bowl. Mike Florio, Pro Football Talk, broke this down great. He plays a Super Bowl on a broken leg and is the best player on the field. Philly was totally fine keeping him. He wanted a new contract, and that's what caused the issue there. He then goes to Dallas, performs great. When he has time left on his contract in Dallas, they gave him a new contract. Then they got rid of him, and then he was with Buffalo and with Cincinnati. He signed one-year deals, played well, and was done after the year. The idea that he was kicked to the curb a dozen times is not accurate, and we are going to get into very uncomfortable territory if the NFL, if the Pro Football Hall of Fame voters are going to try to make the argument how you act in the locker room matters, but how you act at home doesn't. What your criminal arrest record is doesn't. As soon as you take it past what were the numbers, you get in a really uncomfortable place. And I do understand that that maybe 1,000 catches and 100 touchdowns was a fair standard 20 years ago. And it's got to maybe evolve because it's become so.
Well, it has to evolve because every decade they're throwing the ball 8 to 10% more.
It's got to evolve.
Since the 70s.
Bingo. It's got to evolve at least somewhat. But it can't evolve so much when you're top 3 in both categories that you're left out.
Yeah,
it just can't. It's absurd.
Oh, I understand. When I retired, I was number 2 in catches and number 2 in touchdowns.
Yeah, but you talked a little too much, and all you want to do was catch touchdowns, so you waited 5 years. It's a damn crime.
I ask you guys this. Is the process flawed? And you mentioned this yesterday on the show, that if they have moved the finish line, then do we need to take a look at the voters and how they do it? I've spoken to Marshall Faulk over at NFL Network, and he says, I think the Hall of Famers should have a say. I think we should have a vote. And if not, I think the voters, their vote should be made public. So at least maybe there's some reasoning.
I agree with the vote should be made public. The Hall of Famers, we do have a say.
Well,
right?
two
Marshall,
now. Well,
Marshall,
yeah.
they send us an email. All right? They send us out printed information. We vote for the Hall of Famers. We actually have 2 Hall of Famers that sit in the meeting.
Dan Fouts.
Dan Fouts and James Lofton. So they accumulate the votes of all the Hall of Famers. They give a sheet to the Hall of Fame Selection Committee. This is who the 175 living Hall of Famers, this is who they think should be in the Hall of Fame. So the Hall of Famers, we do have a say.
You have,
all right?
and I don't more as an individual,
we shouldn't have a
perhaps.
better say than people that have been writing and covering the game for 20 and 30 years. No, we shouldn't. Just because we're in the Hall, we shouldn't have that kind of vote.